Welcome to Install from Heap, a Netrunner podcast from Rattlebox Games about jank, deck building, and cyberpunk nonsense. This is episode 8. Wait for it. I'm Brendan Bryan. Introduction. Sometimes when you're feeling blue, or perhaps feeling a little stressed, maybe you have comfort food that you like to eat. Salt and vinegar potato chips, perhaps? Sometimes when you're feeling game-wise, a little blue or a little stressed, maybe you have a game you like to play. I like Agricola a lot. I really enjoy Dead Man's Draw. That's an easy one and a fun one. Ghost Stories is a good time, although you can get clobbered pretty hard. So I guess what I wanted to talk about a little bit today is a comfort show. There's a show that I enjoy. So I've watched it a few times, at least 3. And part of what I enjoy is the familiarity of it. It's pretty standard in its format, but there's a lot of cleverness too. And that shows How I Met Your Mother. I'll admit, toward the end, it got kind of cheesy and probably lost some viewers as it got overly sappy and kind of full of itself. But it also, at that point, had the most callbacks to its earlier episodes and sort of did the most fan service, which, as a fan, was really nice for me. So, of course, I was really excited when, a few months ago, the Fantasy Flight page about Netrunner leaked the news about Bryan Stinson, the new character for Wayland from the Quorum data pack, which is the most recent one, who is basically a copy of Barney Stinson, a character from How I Met Your Mother. Today is all him yim. We're going to be talking about a How I Met Your Mother themed deck in the deck building segment. In the executive bootcamp segment, we're going to be learning rules quirks, small changes, things in the rules that you didn't expect, kind of like at parts of How I Met Your Mother where they do callbacks or subtle humor in the background. And for the flavor of the week, we're going to look at Bryan Stinson and see how closely the card matches the theme of Netrunner, matches the theme of the show How I Met Your Mother. Stick with me. It'll be fun. Segment 1, Deck Building, the How I Met Your Mother deck. So if you haven't watched How I Met Your Mother, Barney Stinson is the latest in a long line of trickster characters in sitcoms. They're generally bachelor men with lascivious attitudes, and the show forgives them their womanizing, usually because at their heart, they are good people, even if their behavior does not show that. The ideal model for this character that I remember is Sam Malone, the bartender owner of Cheers, who every episode was dating a different bimbo, but ultimately became the heart of the show. Now, How I Met Your Mother maintained a ensemble cast and an ensemble design much more thoroughly than Cheers did, but Barney Stinson's character is essentially Sam Malone a little bit more recently and a little bit more crudely. How I Met Your Mother is not a children's show. I guess Cheers wasn't either, but they were a little more subtle in their jokes. So the character in How I Met Your Mother is a businessman, and throughout the series we don't know what his job is. Every time someone asks him what his job is, he says, "Please," as though they can't possibly understand what it is he does. Toward the end of the series, we do find out what his job is, and so I'm going to play that clip now. Heads up, if you're thinking about watching How I Met Your Mother, this is a bit of a spoiler, so I would urge you not to listen. Fast forward about a minute.
Kids, in all the time we knew Barney, there was one question he would always answer the same way.
Seriously, what is it that you do? Please.
Okay, seriously, what do you do for a living?
Please. Well, what do you do for a living? Please. Tell us more about this job.
Provide legal exculpation and sign everything. Just show up every day, scribble your name in a bunch of documents, and we'll pay you 16 crap loads a year.
I'm going to put off analyzing Bryan Stinson, the Netrunner version of Barney Stinson, until the theme segment and later in the episode. But for now, I want to talk a little bit about my How I Met Your Mother deck. I do want to give a shout out to the users Trundle and Kevin Savage on the StimHack forums for helping me with brainstorming this deck a little bit. So what I did for my How I Met Your Mother deck is I thought about the world of the show, and I thought about the 5 main characters, as well as the central employment for several of them throughout the series, which is Goliath National Bank. And I decided I would center it around the corp side, 1, because it's a bank, and 2, because all of the characters in How I Met Your Mother are upper middle class, or perhaps even upper class, white people living in New York. So they have a lot of money, and they generally don't suffer from, even when the characters are suffering from sort of poverty, they're not really suffering from any kind of poverty. And like all sitcoms in New York, they have crazy big apartments. decided to go with a corp deck, and I've picked out a few cards for each character. I'm not going to go through all the cards here because that would take a really long time. I will put up a link in the show notes to the deck on Netrunner DB where you can look at the deck and make comments yourself. So to start with, I chose the identity Titan Transnational, Investing in Your Future, which of course you'll remember says whenever you score an agenda, you may place one agenda counter on it. It's from Order and Chaos, and it's a Wayland identity. It also has a little bit more influence. It's a 17, which is particularly useful because I wanted to pull cards from a lot of different places based on theme. First run of this deck, I actually included a little bit wider variety of cards, and I discovered that it's a terrible deck. So I went back and revised a little bit, narrowed it down to about 6 cards per character, plus 4 for the Goliath National Bank, and that's where we are. To start with, Goliath National Bank is represented by Titan Transnational, and then we have the Hedge Fund, NASX, which is the new pad campaign replacement, and Mausolus, all of which are related to banking. Not that exciting thematically. So let's dive into the characters. First, we have Bryan Stinson, who is the most clear connection to the How I Met Your Mother world. And so to be inspired by Barney, I went with a couple things. I used Global Food Initiative. There's an episode where Barney works at a food kitchen, and we learned that he's been compelled to work there because he peed on a church. Include the Cleaners. There's an episode where he trashes Lily and Marshall's house, and we learned that he has a squad of cleanup people who will come and clean up his messes. And then I thought I would also include Restructure, because Barney regularly talks about getting bonuses and firing people, and so it seems like Restructure is a good bonus for him. It also works really well with the card Bryan Stinson. But really, I'm making these choices thematically instead of strategically. There are a couple more as well, but let's move on. The next character is Robin Schabatsky. Robin is a Canadian who's a gun lover, and she works in the news. So those are kind of the main things I went with. For Canada, I said Ice Wall. That's a good ice choice. For news, I went with a couple of the news ones, News Team and Expose. And then also Jackson Howard. There's an odious character from How I Met Your Mother named Sandy Rivers. And he's particularly greasy and always hitting on Robin. And he seems like a perfect Jackson Howard person. And finally, I included a Contract Killer card to reflect Robin's love of guns. For Marshall, our sort of big teddy bear lawyer character, I included a couple things, including Bioethics Association and Tribunal. Both of these are law-related, as well as, of course, Zealous Judge. And finally, I think the highlight here would be Draco, the piece of ice. It's not a good card, but we regularly learn that Marshall believes in Sasquatch and he believes in the Loch Ness Monster, and so including a mystical creature seems like it would fit. Finally, I'll add one more. Marshall is an environmental lawyer, so I included geothermal fracking as something he would fight, but something in the world of How I Met Your Mother. The character of Lily was the hardest one. Lily is a school teacher. She's a great drinker, a great eater. She's also got a justice streak in her. They call it Aldrin Justice, is her last name, Aldrin. And she will, if she thinks you're going to do something bad, she might steal the thing you're going to use to do it or punish you in some way. She is really an interesting character. Really hard to find connections for How I Met Your Mother. There's a character called Lily Lockwell, and I had her in the deck for a little bit, but one, I really didn't like using her. She didn't fit my playstyle. And two, as a Wayland deck, she was really intense on the influence, and so I couldn't figure out how to keep her in there. But here's the things I went with Lily. Recalling 2 events from the show, I included Hive, because her dad lets bees out in their house at one point, and Macrophage, because there's a long-running gag about how she doesn't like people to know she's sick. And then the rest of these are all about her punishment streak: witness tampering, preemptive action, punitive counterstrike, and scorched earth. All of these are around the idea that Lily, when she's mad at you, she will really mess with you. I was particularly pleased to find preemptive action because we learn in the show that Lily has broken up Ted a couple times because she didn't like the woman he was dating. And finally, we have Ted, a character that I'm not particularly fond of. He's the center point of the show, but makes a lot of dumb choices. I guess I'm particularly irritated with him because I had a student once tell me that I reminded her of someone from the show, and in my head I thought, hey, it's going to be Marshall. I'm tall, I'm from Minnesota, I'm generally pretty genial. And then she said I reminded her of Ted, which I presume is because I use big words and I'm a professor. But Ted's the worst, so I don't want to be reminded of Ted. Now I've told my entire listening audience that. So a couple cards for Ted. I chose Levy University to represent his time working as a professor. I chose Medical Research Fundraiser and Caduceus to represent the time that he was engaged to a doctor, as well as Vanity Project, because the doctor's then husband wrote a screenplay about Ted and made Ted look bad. So there's a joke there. I also included 2 more cards about Ted: Architect, because Ted is in fact an architect, and Builder, because it's kind of like Architect, although that's a terrible card, and I don't know if I should keep it in there or not. It might be better to swap it out and just go double with another card, because I do have, I could do that. So that's the How I Met Your Mother deck. The idea is to play cards that are only thematically related, but also have a reasonably fun time. I played this deck a couple times. Both times I lost, but they were both close games, and it didn't feel terribly broken. Since the first version of the deck had government takeover in it, because there's a subplot where one of the characters at Goliath National Bank talks about them overflowing government. So I had that in there, but both games that I lost because the person stole government takeover. And had they been stealing a 2 or 3 point agenda, I would have had more time. So I think in retrospect, the government takeover is not a good choice to include, even though thematically it really worked well. Instead, I just swapped out and had some doubles and triples of other agendas to make up for the points. What other cards did I miss? What would you add to How I Met Your Mother deck if you were to make one? Or I'm interested to know, what show would you be interested in making a deck about, or should I consider as a future topic? All right, on to Executive Boot Camp. Okay, for my Executive Boot Camp section today, I wanted to talk a little bit about rules quirks, about learning the nature of rules for the game that you're playing, and the way that those rules can confuse or influence what you're doing. For example, here are some rules to survive the zombie apocalypse.
Rule number 1 for surviving Zombieland: cardio. When the virus struck, for obvious reasons, the first ones to go were the fatties. But as the infection spread and the chaos grew, it wasn't enough to just be fast on your feet. You had to get a gun and learn how to use it. Which leads me to my second rule, the double tap. In those moments when you're not sure the undead are really dead, don't get all stingy with your bullets.
This subject comes out of my experience with Adonis campaign and with Pad campaign. I've talked about this before, that when I started playing, as a casual player, I didn't understand that you could, or it never occurred to me that you could res your cards on the other player's turn. That as the corp, there is a window at the end of your turn where you might res something you've had sitting out all round. That I would, when I started playing, I think probably many naive players do this, I would play Adonis and then res it right away, and then it'd have to sit there for the runner's whole turn, and they could trash it any time in there and take my money, or prevent me from earning my money. Then when I started playing Jinteki.net, I learned that I could res it at the end of the runner's turn, thereby preventing me from losing my whole 4 credits if they trash it. Instead, I'll just lose 1. Then a couple of weeks ago, I was listening to another podcast. I think it was ANR Bad Publicity. And somebody commented that there's a res window at the beginning of the turn before the turn begins. Not at the end of the runner's turn, but the beginning of the turn before the turn begins. And I went and looked, and sure enough, there is. When your turn begins as a corp, you can do things to change the board state, such as resing cards, before your turn begins. I find that really strange, that's a separate window from the end of the runner's turn. In part, that's there. The reason it's important that's there is there are cards that the runner can do things at the very end of their turn. And you would, if you're doing this res at the end of their turn thing, you'll be in that window. Whereas instead you could res at the beginning of your turn before your turn starts, which means you still get to pull the money off the Adonis campaign. That blew my mind. I'll leave aside the fact that I think thematically that's broken. It just seems dumb to me that you can change the board state before your turn begins and then do things that are supposed to happen when your turn begins. But there's lots of stuff like that. But for me, it blew my mind that this window was there and I didn't know. So I began to think about these weird little rules quirks and how do we understand them. For the casual player, these rules quirks are excellent for understanding the game better, for just being able to enjoy the time that you have with your friends playing Netrunner because you better understand the system. Whether or not it makes you better at the game, it certainly doesn't make me better at it. I also think it helps you develop better sense for janky decks, right? There are cards that you first receive. When you read them, you think, oh man, this would be amazing. Tyr's Hand, for instance, is an early card that seems like it should allow you to really stick it to a runner because you can stop them from breaking a subroutine. But in fact, you just prevent them breaking the subroutine once. They can just do it again. So unless they've really done something that's irreversible, used a token off of Lady or something, Tyr's Hand is a pretty bad card. Another example of that is Chum. Chum is a great card because it adds to the strength of the next piece of ice that you encounter, but you can jack out before you actually encounter the next piece of ice, meaning that Chum does nothing. There are cards that, once you understand the timing system better and the run system better, you can avoid building around a game interaction you don't understand. It seems like for competitive players, this is even more important because these tiny windows, these little rules quirks, allow them to find key combos and eke out a victory on this razor thin margin that is Netrunner at its best. So I posted a thread in the forum asking StimHack participants what were some rules quirks that blew their mind when they heard them. And here are a couple that I encountered. One, somebody said that understanding the order of the when encountered effects takes a little getting used to, and I definitely have had that experience. I think I've talked about the weird experience of discovering that Inside Job or Femme Fatale gets around when encountered effects like Toll Booth. That's weird to me, but it makes sense. Even weirder, the new Wayland Identity Builder of Nations happens when an encounter ends, which means that even if you have a bypass effect, you're still going to get hit by Builder of Nations. Because, for instance, let's say that, so remember, Builder of Nations does 1 meat damage when a runner encounters a piece of ice with an advancement token on it. So let's say the runner makes a run, uses Inside Job to get past 1 piece of ice that has an advancement token on it. Well, the way that works is the runner encounters the ice. The runner's ability from the Inside Job triggers first, which lets them bypass the ice, meaning that any unencountered effects from the ice do not happen. But then the encounter ends. And having ended, now Builder of Nations triggers. And that's actually errata as a way of making Builder of Nations somewhat playable, because if you can bypass the ice and not trigger that effect, it's pretty worthless. It's not very good anyway, but I like it. So that's one example from StimHack. A couple more. User Madarnan, Madarnann, reminded us that Space Ice doesn't work with Blue Sun. This is pretty interesting. So the Wayland ID Blue Sun allows you to, at the beginning of your turn, take back ice that you've rezzed and get the money that it costs to res it. So a lot of people will combine this with cards that let you res for free, and then you get the money that you would have spent rezzing the ice, and they will use really big ice like Janus or Wotan, and then they let you pull that back and get all the money from rezzing it. Well, the Space Ice gets cheaper to res with each advancement token on it. If you put 5 advancement tokens on an Orion, instead of costing 15 to res, it costs 0. But that means if you pull it back, it also costs 0 because the advancement tokens are still there. Now, somebody pointed out that if you had Trick of Light, which lets you pull advancement tokens off, or one of the other cards that lets you move them around, you could use the advancement tokens to res the Space Ice for free, and then move those tokens off, and then pull it back with Blue Sun. That's a lot of work. The last one I want to call attention to is from user Eric Twice, who started an interesting conversation about Scavenge. Now, this is not a card I've used much. Scavenge allows you to, you have to trash an installed program, and then install a program from your grip or heap, lowering the install cost of that program by the cost of the program trashed. What's interesting about this has emerged in rulings is that in order to play Scavenge, the runner must have a viable target at the beginning of playing it to use. In other words, if there are no programs in the grip or in the heap, the player can't use Scavenge. However, the player can trash a program that's installed and then reinstall that program that has been trashed, as long as there was at least one other program they could have installed when they played Scavenge. Now, frankly, I don't understand why you would want to trash and reinstall the same program, but if you're playing a deck that gives you some bonus for installing programs, especially if you're installing them from heap, the way that Exile does, install from heap, then I think Scavenge might be a useful way to just cycle and use that power again. It's a zero-cost event, so it would be easy to use. In fact, I suspect that's what it's for. Thank you to Madarnan and Eric Twice for those responses. There are actually 43 different replies in this thread on StimHack. So if you have another moment, another quirky card rule that blew your mind, pop over there and offer it in the thread. I'll post a link from the show notes. So the result of this survey and conversation with the StimHack folks is a couple things. First, I identified for myself as a more casual player where rules quirks come from. First, imprecise reading of the card. Tyr's Hand is a good example there. If you don't read it carefully, or Chum, if you don't read it carefully, you don't realize the big gap in the way it works. Unclear issues on timing also become a crucial element. The more you know about timing, the easier it is to understand the way the cards interact. I think part of these rule quirks come from complex interactions among the many cards. This is one of those places where sometimes you'll find rulings from lead designers that seem like the lead designer just decided how it worked, rather than having a rule to go from, because literally the way the cards interact doesn't create a rule. Some of the rules quirks come from that sort of thing. And finally, every now and again I'll see complaints about templating or wording, which is really that the cards need to be consistent in the way they refer to things and the language that they use to make it easier for players to interpret cards and to take a ruling from one card and apply it to another. And Netrunner hasn't always been good at that. Even in the most recent couple packs, there was a card that referred to returning cards to your hand instead of your grip, which was kind of confusing. So if you encounter one of these rules problems, what do? There are 4 things that I do. First, I find Google is the fastest way. If you have a card interaction and you're not sure what to do, if you Google the question, the full question with the names of the cards and the word Netrunner, most of the time you can just find a forum where someone has already answered this question. That's really useful. There's a website called ANCUR. I say Anchor in my head, but it is the Android-netrunner community unofficial rules wiki. And it's basically a list of all of these things, along with citations about where they come from. So if you want to know what happens when 2 cards interact, you can find the reference where someone asked that of Lucas or Damon, and they explained it. You can also look on StimHack or Reddit. Both of these are robust communities that will often answer questions quickly or already have. And it's that second part that's really useful. Finally, Fantasy Flight regularly answers questions in their FAQ. And it's interesting, sometimes they change their answers and they will change in the FAQ. For instance, in doing research for this, I discovered that Global Food Initiative has actually changed the way that it's understood. When Global Food Initiative first emerged, people had questions about punitive counterstrike. Because GFI counts as 3 points in calculating agenda points for the game, but only 2 points in the runner's score area, how much damage do you do when you are attacking with a punitive counterstrike, which you'll recall does meat damage equal to the number of agenda points stolen by the runner in the last turn. In the original ruling, Fantasy Flight decided that it counted as 2, because that's how many points the runner was stealing. They have since revised that, and I'm not really sure what was the impetus for that, but the new ruling is that GFI counts as 3 points for the purposes of punitive counterstrike. And they've actually issued errata for that card, saying that the way that punitive counterstrike should read is punitive counterstrike does meat damage for the number of printed agenda points on cards stolen by the runner in the last turn. So they are explicitly calling out the points on the card rather than the points it's worth to the runner. I think that was a good move and makes punitive counterstrike a little bit better when otherwise it's kind of a crummy card by itself. Okay, on to the flavor of the week. Flavor of the Week is the segment of the show in which I look at a card or a set of cards and I examine them from the perspective of theme. This was inspired by a now defunct StimHack column called Running on Italics, which was my favorite thing on the site. I hope it comes back. Please, please. So what I like to do is look at a card and I look at its art, its mechanics, its flavor text, and I examine how does the card fit the theme of the game. So this week, not surprisingly, I'm looking at the How I Met Your Mother inspired card, Bryan Stinson. So we learned that Barney puts himself in jeopardy every time he signs one of these documents, but he's got a plan.
Wait, that's your job? You sign sketchy, legally binding documents that could implicate you for God knows what?
Barney, you're being stupid. The company is setting you up as their fall guy for all of their illegal activities.
And then, kids, Barney revealed to us his master plan. It all went down a few months after the wedding.
Hey, Greg, I know you're busy, but FYI, I've been colluding with the feds. They know everything, and they're on their way up right now to shut down this division and arrest you.
Why would you do that?
Oh, gosh, countless moral reasons could have applied, but this is pretty much revenge for stealing my girlfriend.
For flavor of the week, I want to examine Bryan Stinson from two directions. One, how well does it integrate the theme of How I Met Your Mother into the game? And secondly, how well does the card work in the world of Netrunner? So first, integrating into the game. The character Bryan Stinson looks a lot like Neil Patrick Harris's character, or close enough that you can definitely recognize the similarity there. The name Bryan Stinson is so close to Barney Stinson that it fits, and the quote at the bottom is almost a direct quote from the show. So these are all, and he works at a bank. So these are all really tight connections to the show. On the other hand, I'm not sure the mechanics really tie to Barney that well. We don't get the impression that he's actually very good at his job or at doing business things. In fact, the whole idea of his job is that he doesn't have to do any of that. And so it's not clear why the mechanics of the card fit. So let's talk about how they fit in Netrunner themselves. Here's what the card reads. It's an upgrade, which is nice because it doesn't need to be in its own server. While the runner has fewer than 6 credits, Bryan Stinson gains, click, play a transaction operation from archives, ignoring all costs. Remove that transaction from the game instead of trashing it. He costs 2 to res and 5 to trash. And he's 3 influence, so you're probably not going to see him outside of Wayland very often. So Bryan Stinson's an interesting card. People are talking about it as a really important generator of revenue for the Corp. One, it's an upgrade, which means you don't need to protect another server in order to keep it. 2, it allows you to accelerate a transaction completely. This is really important. Cards like Hedge Fund and Restructure provide a significant econ boost by themselves. Hedge Fund costs 5 to play, and it gives you 9 back. Restructure costs 10 to play and gives you 15 back. So those cards give you 4 and 5 credits by themselves. But you have to have the credits to begin with. By contrast, once you've played those cards, or once you even just discarded them because you couldn't play them, Bryan Stinson allows you to play them ignoring all costs, meaning that instead of paying 5 and gaining 9 for the hedge fund, you pay 0 and gain 9. The same is true for Restructure, except 15. I think Restructure's coming back in a big way, in part because of Bryan Stinson and the econ boost that he gives. So just if you have Bryan Stinson installed and the runner ends their turn with fewer than 6 credits, you could res him for 2. You could play 2 Restructures and a hedge fund, and they would have 39 credits. Or even just 2 Restructures or 1 Restructure, 15 credits for 1 click. It's crazy. So this is a crucial card, I think, for the econ engine in Wayland, and I think we're going to see a lot of him. It's also going to make runners get used to the idea that they shouldn't be ending their turn with fewer than 6 credits. However, in terms of theme in the game, Bryan Stinson is an empty vessel if you don't know How I Met Your Mother. It means nothing, right? And so then you go to the quote, provide legal exculpation and sign everything. The whole idea here is that Bryan is setting himself up for trouble and doesn't realize it. He's a patsy. But the things they're asking you to do are transactions you do anyway. They seem more like something that a financial wizard would be able to do. You know, perhaps the character from American Psycho, or perhaps Michael Douglas's main character from Wall Street. These would be guys who would be seen as having the financial wherewithal to make these transactions pay out huge. Barney isn't that guy. If this is supposed to be a patsy, I would say a more reasonable effect for this character would be Barney is able to do things that would normally cause a bad publicity tag, and they don't cause a bad publicity tag. So while Bryan Stinson is active, rezzing illicit ice or doing those sorts of things does not cause a bad publicity. That would be, and maybe if Bryan Stinson is trashed, you do gain a bad publicity. That seems to me like it would really fit the theme of what Barney's character does at Goliath National Bank instead of what Bryan does here. That said, I'm really excited for Bryan. As a card, I'll give it an A. I think it's exciting. It's going to be great. Make Wayland great again. As an adaptation of the How I Met Your Mother character, I'm going to give it a C. It looks great, but I don't think the mechanics work at all. Well, that's it for episode 8 of Install from Heap. If you have suggestions for future topics or comments on the show, I'd love to hear them. You can send email to brendan@rattleboxgames.com or tweet to rattleboxgames. You can visit our website, rattleboxgames.com, to subscribe to our newsletter, or follow the link to our forums on BoardGameGeek.com, where my username is Wombat929. I'd always enjoy losing a game of Netrunner to you on Jinteki.net, where my username is also Wombat929. If you have a chance and you're enjoying the show, please think about rating us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from. It helps make the show more visible to other users. And also, give us a mention on BoardGameGeek or StimHack or Reddit, the places where I am posting notices of the show. Or even just pop in and say hello. It's always nice to hear from listeners. So until then, see you next time. But remember, when all your best cards end up in the trash, you can always install from heap. Today's media clips were from How I Met Your Mother and Zombieland.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.
Hi, this is Rob, the Dungeon Master for Rattlebox Games podcast, The Matter of Drag. I'm here with our 3 players. One word. Why should people listen? Bernard.
Yeah!
Larn.
Piglets! Can I try again?
All right, Raven. Bring them home. What's your one-word reason for why everyone should tune in every other week to The Matter of Drag podcast?
I mean, like, fire. Yes, fire. Do I not get another chance?
In Dungeons & Dragons promos, as in life, there are no second chances. But you get a chance every other week to listen to us. See you there.